The storm and the broken things. The rain came down in sheets that night. Not the polite, apologetic kind of rain that taps at windows and murmurs along gutters. This was the other kind, the kind with intention behind it, the kind that had been building over the Gulf for 3 days before it finally lost patience and threw itself against the hill country with the full weight of its accumulated fury. It turned the highway into a shallow river. It drowned the yellow lines and dissolved the shoulders and made the world beyond a car's headlights into a wall of moving gray. It was the kind of rain that made sensible people stay indoors, make tea, and feel quietly grateful for walls. Eli Marsh was not a sensible person. Or rather, and this was the distinction he would have made if anyone had asked, which no one ever did, he was too sensible to ignore a distress call. Even one that made no logical sense. Even one that arrived on a dead frequency at 11:40 on a Tuesday night while he was trying to finish a brake job on a 9 Tacoma that had been sitting on his lift for 2 days, because the owner kept finding new things wrong with it every time Eli called with an update. The sensible thing, the reasonable thing, was to lock up the garage, go home, eat whatever was left in the refrigerator, and deal with the world again in the morning. Eli had never been particularly good at the reasonable thing when something was broken and needed help. The message, if it could be called that, had come through the emergency radio mounted on the wall above his workbench. An old unit analog that he kept because it had belonged to his father and because it still worked, which was the only reason Eli ever needed to keep anything. He hadn't touched the dial in months. The frequency it was tuned to was one that nobody used anymore, a relic of an older emergency communication system that had been phased out when the county upgraded its infrastructure 8 years ago. There was no reason for anything to come through it. And yet, it wasn't words. He was certain of that after. He replayed the sound in his memory many times in the weeks that followed, and it was never words, not even close to words, not even the kind of distorted, almost language you got from a badly tuned station bleeding through from another frequency. It was something else entirely, a pattern in static, a shape in noise, a rhythm that his brain seized on the way it seized on the knock of a misfiring engine or the particular grinding tone of metal on metal where there should be none. His mind was built for pattern recognition. It had been built that way by 15 years of listening to machines tell him what was wrong with them, learning their vocabulary of vibration and sound and heat, learning to read the language of broken things. Whatever came through that radio spoke a version of that language. It pulled at him the way instinct pulls at a person before the mind has caught up with a reason. Before he had consciously decided anything, his hands were moving, pulling his reins slicker off the hook by the door, lifting his main toolbox from the bench, muscle memory overriding the part of his brain that was still trying to ask sensible questions. He locked the garage behind him. He drove his battered pickup, a 96 F-250 that he kept alive the way a surgeon keeps a patient alive, with skill and stubbornness and a refusal to accept inevitability, out of the lot and into the rain. He drove toward the dark hills outside of town, following something he couldn't have explained with words and didn't try to. The road that climbed into the hills was a county road, 2 lanes, maintained with the kind of minimal commitment that suggested the county knew about it but preferred not to think too hard about it. In good weather it was fine. In this weather it was a suggestion. The pickup's wipers ran at full speed and made approximately no difference. Eli drove by feel as much as by sight, knowing the road the way you know a room you've walked through in the dark, not by seeing it, but by having learned it well enough that the knowledge lived in the body rather than the mind. He turned off the county road onto the track that ran toward the old quarry. The quarry had been closed for 20 years. The company that had operated it had gone under in the late 90s, and the land had passed through several sets of hands since then without anyone doing anything with it, which meant it had slowly returned to itself in the way that land does when humans stop paying attention to it. The access track was still there, gravel under accumulated years of leaf litter and mud and invasive grass, and the pickup found it and held it with the confidence of a vehicle that had done worse. Beyond the quarry, the land dropped into a wide valley, not deep but broad, cupped between 2 ridges like a palm held open. In daylight it was unremarkable. Scrub oak and cedar, a seasonal creek that ran along the eastern edge, outcroppings of limestone that jutted from the hillsides in formations the geology was still slowly arguing with itself about. Eli came around the curve at the quarry's edge, and his headlights swept across the valley below. He stopped the truck. He sat very still. His brain, which had been running well ahead of him all evening, suddenly fell completely quiet. 2 creatures the size of freight trains lay collapsed in the mud at the valley floor. Their bodies steamed in the cold rain, great billowing clouds of vapor rising from them and dissolving into the storm, and the steam and the rain and the darkness combined to make them look in those first fragmented seconds like something industrial, some catastrophic structural failure, some piece of enormous machinery that had fallen from the sky. Eli's eyes went looking for the familiar. They found outlines that didn't resolve into anything his experience contained. Long shapes, enormous shapes, a quality of surface that his headlights caught and threw back in ways that glass and steel did not. And then one of them moved. A sound rose from its chest, not a roar, nothing so dramatic as that. More like a groan, but a groan at a frequency that the ground conducted as well as the air, a sound that Eli felt in his sternum and his back teeth and somewhere deep behind his eyes. It was the sound of something enormous in pain, and it was unmistakable across every barrier of species and experience and reason. Eli Marsh, 34 years old, mechanic, part-time cynic, owner of a one-bay garage in a town of 9,000 people, understood with complete and absolute clarity what he was looking at. Dragons. Real ones. He sat with that knowledge for a moment. He was aware that it was extraordinary. He was aware that the correct response to it probably involved a great deal more shock and disbelief than he was managing. He was aware that a reasonable person would have questions, deep, fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the reliability of perception, and perhaps the wisdom of having skipped dinner. He also noticed that one of them was breathing in a way that suggested it might stop soon if something didn't change. His mechanic's brain, which had been momentarily stunned, rebooted. Something is broken, something needs fixing. Everything else, every question, every fear, every perfectly legitimate reason to turn the truck around, moved to the back of the line. He left the headlights on, angled down into the valley as best he could manage, and climbed out into the rain. The cold hit him immediately, the kind of wet cold that goes through a rain slicker like it isn't there and settles into the shoulders and the lower back and begins making long-term plans. He didn't notice it much. He was already looking at the two figures ahead of him, already taking inventory, already beginning the initial assessment that preceded every repair job he had ever done. The larger of the two was a deep iron gray, its scales the color of old battleships and overcast skis, with a quality of density to them that suggested they had been accumulating since before anyone alive had been born. It was enormous in a way that numbers failed to capture. Numbers said freight train, and that was accurate in terms of length and weight, but it missed the quality of the thing, the sense that it occupied space differently than other objects did, that it had a kind of gravitational presence that made the air around it feel different. Its left flank was damaged severely. The scales along that side were cracked and displaced, some of them missing entirely, in a pattern that told Eli something had struck it with tremendous lateral force. The way an impact pattern in a vehicle's door panel told the story of a collision whether the car could speak or not. Whatever had hit this creature had been very large and had been moving very fast. The smaller one, still the size of a city bus, still larger than anything Eli had ever stood next to, was a deep arterial red, the color of old brick in the rain, darkened with moisture but still carrying an amber quality that suggested the color ran all the way through. It lay curled around the gray one with the deliberate, protective completeness of someone who has decided that they will not leave regardless of circumstances or cost. The posture was achingly familiar. Eli had seen it in dogs waiting beside injured companions, in the way certain people arrange themselves beside hospital beds. It was the posture of a being that had made its most fundamental choice and was done being moved from it. He stood in the downpour and looked at them for a full 10 seconds. He was afraid. He wanted to be honest with himself about that because he had always believed that pretending not to be afraid was a form of stupidity that got people hurt. He was afraid in the way that standing next to something that could kill you in a variety of effortless ways naturally produced fear, a cold physical fear, information-bearing rather than paralyzing. His body was nodding carefully and precisely all the ways this situation could go wrong. He noted the fear, he acknowledged it, he picked up his toolbox. He approached slowly. He kept his hands visible. It was what you did around animals you didn't know, around machines you hadn't worked on before, around anything that had reasons to be uncertain about your intentions. You showed your hands, you moved without suddenness. You took up only the space you needed and no more. The red dragon's eye opened as he approached. It was amber-colored, with a vertical slit pupil the way a cat's is. But a cat's pupil is a small and manageable thing, and this one was roughly the size of a dinner plate, which changed the experience of being observed by it considerably. The intelligence behind it was immediate and undeniable, not the intelligence of an animal reading threat or opportunity, but something deeper and more considered, the kind of intelligence that recognized categories and made distinctions and had, Eli suspected, been doing so for a very long time. It tracked him without blinking. It did not attack. It watched him the way a suffering creature watches something it isn't sure about yet, with desperate, cautious hope. with the particular quality of attention that belongs to a being who needs help and is not certain help is what it's looking at, but cannot afford to assume otherwise. Eli knew that look. He had seen it on people's faces when they brought him cars they couldn't afford to lose. Easy, he said. It was something he said to cars that didn't want to cooperate, to engines that were reluctant to turn over, to vehicles that had been through things and had developed a personality about it. He said it in the same tone he always used, low and steady, not asking anything dramatic, just establishing that he was there and that he wasn't in a hurry and that things were, given sufficient time and attention, going to be all right. Whatever translation existed between species and epoch and the vast gulf of strangeness that separated them, something in the tone carried. The amber eye stayed on him, but the tension in the red dragon's vast body shifted, slightly, the way a held breath partly releases. Eli moved to the gray one and began to work. Up close, the damage was worse than it had looked from a distance. The cracked scales on the left flank weren't merely surface damage, they had displaced inward in places, and beneath them Eli could see tissue that he had no anatomical name for but that he understood immediately in functional terms. It was structural. It was weight-bearing. It was compromised. The damage had the character of a compound fracture, not just the obvious injury but secondary stresses spreading from the impact point in patterns that would keep doing damage if they weren't addressed. He pressed his palm flat against the largest of the cracked scales. Felt the vibration beneath it. It came up through his hand like a signal, and his brain received it in the same register it received engine noise, pattern, rhythm, deviation. Whatever kept this creature alive operated on principles he couldn't have named in a textbook, but the function of it was legible to him in the most direct way. Something was working hard that shouldn't have to work that hard. Something was compensating for something else that had failed. The rhythm was irregular in a way that spoke of strain, of a system trying to maintain output with reduced capacity. Like an engine running on 3 cylinders when it needed 8. He set his toolbox down in the mud and opened it. The rain came down on him, and he did not think about the rain. He started where he always started, with the most critical failure point, the thing that if left unaddressed would make everything else irrelevant. The breathing. The gray dragon's respiration was labored in a way that suggested the mechanical compromise of its chest. The displaced scales weren't just a surface injury, they were interfering with the expansion and contraction of whatever structures governed its breath. He worked with industrial clamps and hydraulic sealant, repositioning what he could reach, stabilizing what he could stabilize, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years learning to read broken things by touch. The red dragon watched him the entire time. It did not interfere, it did not threaten. It watched with that same amber-eyed intensity, tracking every movement of his hands, and Eli began to understand that it was not merely watching, it was following. Learning. Observing what he was doing with the focused attention of a being who had decided to trust something and was paying close attention to whether that trust was being placed correctly. He worked on the talon next. One of the gray dragon's front limbs had a break that Eli diagnosed the way he would have diagnosed a suspension failure, wrong angle, wrong load distribution. The surrounding structures visibly compensating in ways that would cause secondary damage over time. He had 2 steel fence posts in the truck bed, 5-foot T-posts that he'd been hauling to drop off at a property out on the county road. He retrieved them in the rain and brought them back and splinted the break the way he would have splinted any structural failure, applying everything he knew about load-bearing joints and the distribution of stress across a repair that had to hold under conditions it wasn't designed for. He cleaned debris from wounds the size of manholes. He used the hydraulic sealant everywhere it would hold, building up layers in the places where the structural integrity had been most severely compromised. He worked with cable and clamps and the accumulated ingenuity of a person who had spent a career solving problems with what was available rather than what was ideal. Time passed in the way it always passed when he was deep in a repair job, not linearly, not in minutes and hours, but in the organic rhythm of task and assessment and response. He was not aware of being cold, though he was cold. He was not aware of the rain, though the rain was relentless. He was not aware of his hunger or his exhaustion or the slowly building protest of his lower back, which had opinions about this kind of prolonged crouching that it would be expressing loudly for several days afterward. He was aware of the system he was working on, only that. There was a moment somewhere in the deepest part of the night when the gray dragon's breathing faltered. Not gradually, suddenly a loss of rhythm, a cessation, the terrible quiet of a machine that has stopped. Eli moved without thinking. He put both hands flat against the enormous chest, positioned himself and pressed, rhythmically, firmly, the way he had once restarted a flooded engine with nothing but patience and force and the refusal to accept that the window for intervention had closed. He leaned into it with his full weight, which against a creature this size was a gesture that should have been meaningless. And he pressed and released and pressed and released and talked while he did it. Not words exactly, just the low, steady current of his voice. The same tone he used for engines that needed to remember what they were for. The amber eye of the red dragon was on him with an intensity that pressed like a physical thing. He pressed and released and pressed and released. The gray dragon's chest moved, drew a long, shuddering breath that rolled through the valley like distant thunder. Then another, then settled into a rhythm that, while not strong, was steady, continuous holding. Eli sat back on his heels and breathed himself, a long, unsteady exhale that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He was shaking. Not from cold alone, though certainly from cold, but from the particular full-body aftermath of sustained effort combined with sustained fear. The two of them releasing simultaneously through his hands and his shoulders and the muscles along his jaw that had been clenched without his noticing. He did not sleep. By the time the gray at the horizon began to separate itself from the black, that first barely perceptible shift of deep night into pre-dawn, the world deciding tentatively to start again, both dragons were breathing steadily. The storm had not ended exactly, but it had exhausted its primary ambitions and settled into something less aggressive, a steady rain without the fury behind it, the kind that cleaned rather than assaulted. The valley floor had become a shallow lake of silted water, and Eli sat in it with no particular concern because there was no part of him that was not already comprehensively wet. He became aware slowly of being watched. Not the way he had been watched through the night, the amber eyes focused tracking of his movements. This was different. He looked up. The gray dragon's eye was open. Gold, deeply, anciently gold, not the warm gold of jewelry or the yellow gold of headlights, but the gold of something that had been accumulating time for so long that it had begun to look like the thing time is made of. Slit-pupiled the same way the red one's was, but where the red one's gaze carried intensity and urgency, this one carried something else entirely. Depth. The quality of stillness that belongs to very old things that have seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by it, and started being curious about it instead. It looked at Eli with an intelligence that arrived in him like a shift in air pressure, something he felt before he understood. The red dragon had lifted its head. It watched him now with that expression he still could not find a name for, the one that lived somewhere in the territory between reverence and recognition. As if he were something it had been expecting, though it had not known until this moment that it had been expecting him. Eli looked up at two pairs of ancient eyes, regarding him from two faces the size of walls. He was still shaking. His hands were shaking, and his shoulders, and something in his chest that he suspected had less to do with cold or exertion, and more to do with the fact that the full weight of what he had just experienced was beginning, with the morning, to arrive. He had just saved two dragons. He sat in the mud in the rain in the dawn light and let that fact sit with him for a moment, neither diminishing it nor being crushed by it, just letting it be what it was. "You're going to be okay," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rough with the night and the cold and the hours of low talking in the dark. But it was steady. It was the voice he always used when the worst was over, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but certain. The particular quiet certainty of someone who has stayed with a difficult thing long enough to see it through to the other side. It was what he always said when the crisis had passed, and the work had held, and whatever had been on the edge of being lost had been pulled back far enough to matter. He said it to cars. He had said it to an old woman once when her '78 Buick had broken down 40 miles from anywhere and he'd been the one to stop, and she'd been afraid, and the car had eventually started again. He said it now to two ancient creatures who were, against all reasonable expectation, still alive in the gray morning, their breath rising in steam above the flooded valley floor. The gold eye held him in its gaze. And something moved in it, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, that in a human face would have been called recognition. The arrival of knowledge. The moment of understanding not just what stands before you, but what it means. Eli Marsh, soaked and shaking and 34 years old, and not especially remarkable in any way that a biography would find interesting, met that golden gaze and did not look away. He had no idea yet what was about to change. But the dawn was coming and both of them were breathing, and for now that was everything. They did not leave at dawn the way he expected them to. He had spent the better part of the night telling himself they would. That was what his mind had settled on as he crouched beneath the overhang of the old millstone barn with his knees pulled to his chest, and the cold working its way methodically through every layer he was wearing. The certainty that by morning, whatever strange and impossible thing had descended into the valley would be gone. Dissolved back into the part of reality where impossible things lived when they weren't busy terrifying people who had simply stopped to help what they thought was an injured animal on a back road in the middle of nowhere. He had even rehearsed what he would do when it happened, when the gray light came and the field was just a field again. He would walk back to his truck, which was still running because he'd left it running at the edge of the road out of some instinct he couldn't name, and he would sit in the warmth of it for a moment, and then he would drive home and he would sleep. And when he woke up, he would make coffee and sit at the kitchen table and decide whether what had happened to him was something he ever intended to tell another living person. He had a strong feeling the answer was no. But morning came and the field was not just a field. The pale light settled over the valley like something cautious, like something that wasn't entirely sure of its welcome, and the rain thinned from the steady drum that had kept him company all night into something barely there. A mist that drifted more than fell, hanging in the low places between the hills and catching the gray dawn in a way that made the whole world look like a photograph of itself. And in that light, the two shapes that had seemed so impossible in the dark became no less impossible in the morning, only more solid, more undeniably matter-of-factly real. They were still there. Eli Marsh had fixed things for a living for going on 12 years now. He had a gift for it that he had never quite been able to explain and had mostly stopped trying to. It was not just technical knowledge, though he had plenty of that. It was something quieter and more instinctive, a way of looking at broken things and understanding them from the inside out, the way some people can look at a person crying and know without asking whether what they need is to be held or left alone. He could put his hand on an engine and feel, through the metal and the heat and the particular complaint of the sound, what the problem actually was as opposed to what it looked like on the surface. This had made him good at his job. It had also, he sometimes suspected, made him strange in ways that were hard to quantify. He was thinking about that now, crouched in the pre-dawn with mud soaking through his work pants at the knees, watching the larger of the two dragons breathe. The breathing was remarkable. It wasn't the bellows heave he might have imagined, enormous ribcage expanding and contracting with theatrical effort. It was slower than that, deeper. The rhythm of it was closer to the rhythm of the valley itself, like watching a hillside, like watching something that had learned to breathe by observing geological processes over centuries. Each exhale dispersed into the mist and became part of it, and each inhale drew something back that Eli couldn't see but could feel, a faint pressure change, a subtle shift in the quality of the air around him. He was not afraid anymore. He thought he probably should be, and there was a part of his brain, a small, sensible evolutionary part, that was still jumping up and down at the back of his skull insisting that he should be afraid, that the appropriate response to two creatures the size of buildings was fear, sustained and immediate fear, and that he was failing at basic survival instinct in a way his ancestors would have found deeply embarrassing. But the rest of him had passed through fear sometime around 3 in the morning and come out somewhere quieter on the other side. Not brave exactly, just present, just watching. He had spent the night watching, and the dragons had spent the night breathing, and occasionally the smaller one, the copper-brown one with the damaged wing that he had initially stopped for, thinking it was an enormous injured bird, which he now recognized as a thought so laughably inadequate it barely deserved the word thought, would shift position, and the sound of it was like a building settling, deep structural groans of stone and ancient patience. And the gray one, the larger one, would turn its head at these sounds, and something would pass between them that Eli could not read but could feel. The way you can feel a conversation happening in the next room through a wall, without words, just the shape of meaning moving through solid matter. And then the pale morning came, and they did not live. Instead, as the mist thickened at the low end of the valley and the first birds began their hedging experimental morning attempts at song, the gray dragon lowered its massive head. It lowered it slowly. Everything about these creatures was slow in a way that had nothing to do with lethargy and everything to do with scale. The way a large ship turns slowly not because it is sluggish, but because there is simply so much of it, so much mass with so much momentum, that quick movements are not a matter of ability but of physics. The head came down in a long, slow arc, the neck flexing in segments like something architectural shifting under its own weight, and it came to rest with the jaw settling directly into the mud before Eli's feet. That great blunt jaw, easily 6 feet across, resting in the earth like it belonged there. The gesture was unmistakable. He had seen dogs do it. Border collies at the farm on the edge of town, dropping low before they wanted you to throw something. Old hunting dogs belonging to the farmers he serviced, flattening themselves on the floor when they wanted attention in that way that was simultaneously submissive and completely confident in the outcome. He had seen horses do it, though rarely seen them lower their heads in that particular way that was an invitation and a surrender at the same time. Here, come close. I am making myself smaller than I am so that you will not be afraid. He had never imagined seeing something the size of a building do it, but the meaning was the same, apparently, across every species and every scale. Come closer, we want to show you something. Eli came closer. He moved the way he moved around unfamiliar engines carefully but without hesitation. Hesitation, in his experience, was worse than moving slowly. Hesitation telegraphed uncertainty, and uncertainty was contagious in a way that could make any situation worse. So he moved with deliberate calm he did not entirely feel, closing the 20 feet between himself and the dragon's lowered head, and he stopped when he was close enough to touch it, though he did not touch it yet. He just stood there, close enough to feel the warmth coming off the scales, not heat exactly, more like the warmth of something that had been holding a temperature for a very long time. The warmth of deep stone in summer, the warmth of thermal mass, and he waited. Gray exhaled slowly. And in that breath was something Eli felt in his teeth and behind his eyes. Not heat, not gas, not the sulfur and char he had half expected from a lifetime of absorbing the mythology around creatures like this. Something else entirely. Something that arrived without physical mechanism, that rearranged the air between them on a level he didn't have language for, that made the space feel suddenly intimate in a way that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with intent. The way a room feels when someone closes the door and sits down and looks at you with a particular quality of attention, and you understand before they speak that what is coming is something real, something they have carried for a long time, something they have decided finally to put down. Something they have never told anyone. And then he understood them. Not in words. That was the first thing he noticed, the absolute absence of language, the way meaning arrived without that scaffolding, without that particular human apparatus of subjects and verbs, and the long and lossy process of turning something felt into something said. It was more like the meaning arrived fully formed, complete and immediate, the way you sometimes surface from a dream and the understanding of what it meant is simply there, behind your sternum, installed overnight by some process you weren't conscious of and couldn't reconstruct. You just know. And the knowing doesn't feel like translation. It feels like recognition. The dragons communicated in impression and image, in the weight of memory and the temperature of emotion, in something that moved through him less like language and more like weather, something you stood inside of rather than decoded from outside. And Eli stood very still, the mud cold at his feet and the mist moving around him, and he received it all. Their names did not translate. He felt them, felt the shapes of identity behind the concepts, vast and specific as coastlines, but there was no sound in it, no syllable that would serve, nothing he could carry home and put in a sentence. So he held the impressions without nomming them, which felt strangely like respect. But their story did translate. The story moved through him like a tide. They were the last, not the last dragons in the world. He felt the edges of something larger there, a kind of distributed and diminished presence scattered across geographies he didn't know how to name, but the last of their kind. The architects. That word arrived with the weight of concept behind it, layers of meaning that the single English word could only approximate. The word in human use meant builders, designers, people who conceived of structures and oversaw their making. But what it meant here, in the shape it arrived in his mind, was something older and larger. It meant the ones who understood structure at the level of origin, who built not with hands but with comprehension, with a deep geological intelligence that could identify what a thing was trying to become and assist it. In an age before recorded human history, before the written word, before the very concept of record, these creatures had shaped the bones of the earth, not through violence, not through force. The impression that arrived was nothing like the image of a great creature physically rending the landscape. It was subtler than that, more like conversation. They had sung certain valleys into existence, had breathed particular minerals into stone formations over centuries of patient attention, had sat in places where the earth was trying to decide what it wanted to be and helped it decide, had held geological processes the way a skilled welder holds the temperature of metal, not controlling it exactly, but guiding it, keeping it in the range where the transformation could happen cleanly. Geologists in future centuries would puzzle over certain formations, would find stress patterns that didn't match any known seismic event, would find mineral compositions that required pressures and temperatures that the surrounding rock didn't support, would write papers with titles full of caveats and hedged language because the evidence said something happened here that they couldn't account for, and science is honest enough at its best to say I don't know rather than I don't believe it. The architects had built those things, and now they were dying. Not from their wounds alone, though those were serious. The copper-brown one's wing, he had come to understand, had been damaged not in any fight but in something more like a structural failure. A place in the world where one of the things they maintained had deteriorated past a critical point, had given way suddenly and catastrophically, and the force of that failure had expressed itself physically in the body of the one closest to it. Like a building shifting on its foundation, the crack traveling up through the walls, finding the path of least resistance. They were dying because the world had forgotten how to sustain them. That was the truth underneath all the other truths, and it arrived with a kind of grief that was not self-pity. It was too old for self-pity, too weathered into acceptance, but was grief nonetheless. The specific grief of watching something become unnecessary through no fault of its own, of finding that the relationship between a thing and the world that made it possible had quietly over centuries simply dissolved. That was the first part of the secret. Eli stood in the mist and held it for a moment, the way you hold a weight before you decide whether you can carry it. The second part arrived more quietly. It didn't announce itself. It settled the way heat from a fire doesn't arrive all at once but builds in your skin gradually until you realize you are warm and have been for some time. It hit him somewhere behind the sternum, a slow-spreading warmth that was somehow also specific, somehow also pointed directly at him in a way that made his breath go unsteady for just a moment. They had been watching humanity for centuries. Watching with the patience of things that have centuries to spend on watching, not hungrily, not predatorily, but the way you watch something you are waiting to understand, the way a craftsperson watches an apprentice work, looking for the particular quality of attention that suggests readiness for the next level of difficulty. Not for a hero, he felt the shape of that clearly, felt them dismissing the category with something very close to weariness. They had enough experience with heroes and warriors, vast ancient experience, to understand that what heroes and warriors were good at was not what was needed here. Heroes solved problems at the level of drama. Warriors addressed crises at the moment of their acute expression. Both were necessary things in the world, neither was what the architects required. They had needed something quieter, someone who understood how things worked at the level of function, who could look at something broken and see, simultaneously, what it was and what it was supposed to be and what the path between those two states looked like, who did not need the problem to be dramatic in order to find it worth solving, who was not deterred by the fact that the fix would not be glamorous, would not be witnessed, would not result in anyone knowing that something had been saved, because to know that something had been saved you would first have to understand that it was failing, and almost no one would. They had watched a lot of engineers. He felt the long catalog of them, brilliant minds, technically extraordinary people, individuals who had contributed things to human civilization that would outlast them by centuries. They had watched scientists with gifts that bordered on the supernatural. They had watched legendary inventors across multiple centuries, in multiple cultures, people whose names had become synonymous with ingenuity and transformation. But brilliance wasn't quite the thing. He understood that clearly. Brilliance without patience was a fire that consumed its own fuel. Brilliance married to the wrong kind of pride could not afford to stay with a problem after the interesting part was over. And most problems, most real problems, the kind that existed at the level of deep function rather than surface performance, were not interesting for most of their duration. They were unglamorous. They were tedious. They required the willingness to sit with something that was not working and not leave. Not because you were certain you could fix it, but simply because it was broken and it needed someone to stay. Patience married to intuition. That was the phrase that arrived, or something close enough to a phrase that Eli's mind resolved it into one. The willingness to remain through a cold, ugly night not because it was glorious but simply because something was broken and someone had to stay. The capacity to do the unremarkable work of maintenance without needing the work to be recognized, because the things most worth maintaining were usually invisible until they failed. They had been watching Eli Marsh for 11 years. He sat down heavily in the mud. His legs made that decision without consulting him, which was perhaps the honest response. His legs understood before his mind caught up that this was not a thing you received standing. He sat down in the cold mud at the edge of a mist-filled valley at dawn, and the great gray head was still resting there. 6 feet of ancient jaw settled in the earth, and the warmth of those enormous eyes was on him. And he sat in the mud and tried to find something to say to the fact that he had been watched, specifically and intentionally, for 11 years. "You've been watching me," he said aloud. He knew they understood it before the sound finished forming, felt the understanding land in the space between them the way a returned call lands. But saying it helped him. Hearing the words in his own voice made it real in the particular way that only his own voice could make things real to him. The same way he sometimes described a problem out loud in the empty garage when he was stuck on something. Not because talking to himself helped him think so much as because the sound of it changed the shape of it, gave it edges he could get purchase on. The impression that came back was warm and layered. There was something in it that was like an apology, though without the particular human texture of apology, not guilty so much as aware of the weight of being observed without knowing, aware of the intimacy of the thing they had done, watching someone's life with this kind of attention for this length of time. And underneath the apology was something that was simply and completely yes. Yes, we watched. Yes, it was you. Yes, we were certain, though certainty like that arrived slowly, and the watching was the process by which it arrived. And smaller and gentler than the rest, we are sorry it took so long to find a way to ask. The third part of the secret was delivered with a kind of careful gentleness that Eli recognized from experience. It was the gentleness of someone moving slowly because what they are carrying is fragile, not because they lack confidence in their own steadiness, but because they have respect for the thing being transferred and respect for the person receiving it. You slow down. You make sure the other person's hands are ready before you let go. There were things woven into the structure of the world, not metaphorically, not in any spiritual or abstract sense that Eli would have had to translate into something more concrete to believe. Literally, physically, in the same sense that a beam is woven into a building, load-bearing, structural, failing in silence over decades until the walls show the first fine cracks. They existed in specific places, in particular geological formations in the resonance of certain deep stone, in places where the architects had done their oldest and most fundamental work and where that work now, without hands to maintain it, was deteriorating. Not catastrophically. Not yet. Not in ways that anyone with instruments would notice for a very long time, because what was failing was not something any instrument currently built was designed to measure. It was failing the way a foundation fails, in the deep places, in the places no one looks because no one knows to look there, in the places where everything that stands above depends on what holds below. He understood foundations. He understood the particular horror of the hairline crack in the place no one sees. These were the things the architects had built. These were the things they had maintained across centuries and millennia with the patient attention of beings who understood that a thing maintained never becomes a crisis, and a thing ignored becomes eventually a catastrophe. And these were the things that, without them, were failing, slowly, invisibly, in ways that would not be apparent until they were very far along, which was the worst kind of failing because by then the repair becomes immensely harder than the maintenance would have been. And they could not fix it alone anymore. There were too few of them. He felt the grief of that simply and directly, the arithmetic of diminishment, the way a capability doesn't vanish all at once but erodes, one and then another over centuries, until you find yourself at the count where the things that once took many now require all of you and then more than all of you, and you are finally and fully behind. They were old. Their resources were not what they had been. The world had changed around them in ways they hadn't been able to change to match, and the gap between what was needed and what remained had grown past the point of closing. But they could teach someone. This last piece arrived not as information but as offering. There was something held out in it, something extended with a particular quality of hope that was all the more affecting for being clearly reluctant. Hope is harder for things that have lived long enough to know how many times it hasn't worked out. The hope of something ancient is a more weighted thing than the hope of something young. He felt the weight of it. Eli sat in the mud at the bottom of his valley and looked at the gray dragon's eye, one eye, because that was all he could see from this angle, dark and enormous, and holding something in its depth that he could feel but not fully read. And he looked at the copper-brown one beyond, its injured wing folded carefully against its body, its breathing the same slow geological rhythm. A mechanic 34 years old, one bay garage in a town of 9,000 people on a back road in a state that most people pass through on their way to somewhere else. A waiting list 3 weeks long because he was good and people trusted him, and he had a rule, which was not quite a rule so much as a fact about himself, that he had never once turned away a car that somebody loved even if it wasn't worth the parts. Because the car wasn't the point. The car was never the point. The point was that something was broken and someone cared about it, and there was a version of the world where it worked again, and he was in a position to find that version. And that seemed like sufficient reason to stay. He sat in the mud for a long moment with all of that. "You want me to help you fix the world," he said. He said it simply, not as a question, exactly, he knew the answer, but as a thing that needed to be said out loud in his own voice, so it would be real in the particular way that only saying things out loud makes them real. The impression that came back was warmer than anything he had ever felt. It was not like being told something. It was like being confirmed. Like having something you were uncertain of, some quality you suspected in yourself but had never quite been able to trust, held up by someone who had looked at it carefully and at length and found it sound. It said with absolute certainty, in the way that only things very old and very patient can be certain. "You already have bins. You just didn't know the scale." Eli Marsh sat in the mud as the mist thinned around him and the morning came fully into itself, pale and clean-washed and new. He sat there for a while longer. The dragons breathed. A red-winged blackbird called from the fence line at the far edge of the field, one clear, precise note and then another, marking its territory in the new day. He thought about his garage. He thought about the Henderson's old Subaru that he'd had on the lift for 2 weeks now, coaxing back to life a fuel injection system that any reasonable person would have told them to give up on. He thought about the particular satisfaction of that work, not the glamour of it, because there was no glamour in it, but the rightness of it. The specific rightness of a thing repaired. He thought scale is just a number. He thought broken is still broken whether anyone can see it or not. He put his hand out slowly with the same deliberate care he used when approaching an unfamiliar engine, and he placed it flat against the great gray jaw resting in the mud before him. He felt the warmth of it, the depth of it. Something that had been here longer than his civilization, that had watched everything he was part of rise from nothing into what it was, that had held things together quietly and without recognition for longer than he had language to measure. "All right," he said to the mist, to the valley, to the two impossible creatures watching him with their ancient and particular regard. "Show me what's broken." Eli Marsh did not quit his job. This surprised people later, in the fragmented and half-lit way that it came out, pieces of the story surfacing in conversations he hadn't intended, in the particular way that true things sometimes leak into the world not through any door you've opened, but through the walls themselves, through the invisible porousness of a life lived in a small town where people pay attention. They expected transformation to look like abandonment. That was the shape the story was supposed to take, the one they'd been given by every myth and legend and hero's journey they had ever absorbed from the culture around them. So many of those stories that the template had become invisible, had become simply the way things went. A man is chosen, a man is changed. A man drops everything, walks away from the ordinary life, becomes something else, something mythological. Something that no longer needed the burnt coffee and the 3-week waiting list, and the garage that smelled of grease and metal, and the specific cold of a concrete floor in winter. But Eli had always distrusted stories like that. Not because he was cynical about transformation. He had seen enough broken things come back to know that transformation was real, was possible, was sometimes the only honest outcome. But because the version where you had to leave everything behind to become something better had always struck him as a failure of imagination. As if the ordinary life was just a waiting room. As if everything that happened in it before the extraordinary moment was merely prologue, merely context, merely the boring part you fast-forwarded through to get to the meaning. In his experience, and he had 15 years of it now, 15 years of days that had looked from the outside almost completely undistinguishable from each other, the most important work looked from the outside almost exactly like ordinary life. That was not a disappointing fact. It was actually the most quietly radical thing he knew. So he opened the garage at 7:30 every morning. He still had the 3-week waiting list, which had been 3 weeks for going on 4 years now, because the list was not a reflection of how many cars were waiting so much as a reflection of the pace at which he was willing to work, which was the pace at which the work deserved to be done and not one increment faster. People who were in a hurry found other garages. People who understood that the car they loved was worth waiting for stayed on the list and came back and drank the burnt coffee and left, eventually, with something fixed that they had been afraid was finished. He still kept the burnt coffee. The machine was an old drip model with a warming plate that had 2 settings, hot enough and too hot, and it had been needing replacement for 4 years, which meant it had been needing replacement for as long as the waiting list had been 3 weeks, which meant the replacement was presumably happening in some adjacent version of his life where he had more mornings with nothing pressing in them. In this version, there was always something else. There was always a car that needed looking at, or a part that needed ordering, or a customer sitting in the plastic chair by the window who needed to be told the truth about their transmission in language that was honest without being cruel, which required more craft than people generally credited. There was also now a second thing, but it didn't look like a second thing from the outside. He started taking long drives on weekends. That was how it would have appeared to anyone watching, if anyone had been watching, which in a town of 9,000 people was not an entirely theoretical condition. Eli Marsh, who had always been a mostly predictable fixture of the town's practical life, started disappearing on Saturday mornings into the hill country. Into the old quarry land that nobody farmed anymore and nobody had figured out how to develop, because the geological surveys kept coming back with results that made the engineers nervous in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Into certain stretches of deep forest where the trees were older than the town and grew at angles that didn't quite match the prevailing light, as if they had oriented themselves over centuries toward something other than the sun. He brought his tools. This was noticed. It was the kind of specific detail that stuck in the minds of the few people who saw him loading up on those mornings, the big canvas roll of hand tools that lived on the shelf above the parts bins, the one he rarely took off-site because his work was stationary work, work that came to him. Taking it on a weekend drive was the kind of small anomaly that itched at the edge of people's attention without quite rising to the level of a question. If they had asked, he would have said he was working on something, which would have been true. He learned the new work the way he had learned all the work that mattered in his life. Slowly, through his hands, through failure and adjustment, and the particular understanding that comes not from being taught a thing, but from doing it wrong enough times that you begin to feel the shape of right. Gray and Ember, he had named the red-scaled one Ember sometime in the 3rd week, had offered it tentatively in the way you offer a name to a wild thing, unsure whether it would be accepted or simply ignored. and she had received it with a warmth that he felt in his back teeth and interpreted as acceptable, were rarely visible. This was by design, though whose design he had never quite worked out. His or theirs, or simply the nature of the thing they were attempting together. They were present in the way the wind is present, consistently, structurally felt rather than seen, a force that you know is there because of what it does to the things around it, because of the way the grass lanes and the way a certain pressure changes at the back of the inner ear. He would arrive at a location guided by something he had given up trying to describe in any technical sense, a combination of the impressions they sent him and his own instinct, which had become, over these months, harder and harder to distinguish from each other, and he would feel their attention on him the way you feel a room's attention when you're the person standing up to speak. Not oppressive, not surveillance. Just presence, consistent and patient, the way the best teachers he had ever encountered were present. Available without being intrusive, attentive without being anxious about the outcome. They taught him slowly and patiently and without any expectation of speed, which he appreciated more than he could have said. He had never done well with people who mistook urgency for effectiveness, who confused moving fast with going somewhere. Some of the best work he had ever done had taken 3 times as long as the customer wanted it to, and the result had been 3 times as sound, and the car was still running years later when the cheaper and faster alternative would have failed months in. There was a kind of knowledge you could only get by slowing down far enough that the thing you were trying to understand had time to show itself to you. The dragons understood this. They operated on timescales where patience was not a virtue so much as a basic precondition of doing anything real. He learned, over weeks and then months, to feel things through his hands that he had no language for and made no attempt to name. There were pressures in the earth that were like the pressure of a bearing running without sufficient lubrication, not catastrophic yet, but wearing, slowly and invisibly converting the smooth operation of a system into something rough, something that was consuming itself in the process of functioning. There were resonances in certain rock formations that were like the particular vibration of an engine with a misfire, a rhythm that should have been regular and wasn't, a skip in the cycle that most instruments wouldn't catch, but that the right kind of attention, applied at the right point of contact, could feel clearly. There were structural tensions in places that were like the tension in a frame that had been in a collision and straightened imperfectly. Everything looking fine from the outside, all the visible lines correct, but the load distribution wrong in ways that would express themselves eventually and suddenly and with more force than anyone had anticipated. He learned to address these things through a process that remained, even after many months of practice, stubbornly difficult to describe. It involved his hands. It involved a quality of attention that he had previously only applied to engines and was discovering worked with modifications at considerably larger scales. It involved always the guidance of Gray and Ember, a kind of collaborative perception, the 3 of them triangulating on the problem from their different angles of understanding, Eli bringing the patience and the mechanical intuition and the willingness to stay, the dragons bringing the depth of knowledge about how this particular system was supposed to work, what it was supposed to feel like at its foundation when it was healthy. Together, they could find the thing and address it. He could not have told you precisely what he did when he addressed it. His hands on the stone or the earth, a kind of directed attention, something that Gray and Ember amplified and channeled in ways he didn't have access to, like a craftsperson working with a tool they couldn't see but could feel the results of. The results were real. That was what mattered. He learned in the 4th month that the valley north of town, the one visible from the ridge where he parked sometimes to eat lunch during the week, the one that had always struck him as slightly wrong without being able to say why, the way an engine can sound slightly wrong before you can identify the source, sat on a geological formation that had been quietly destabilizing for 60 years. A slow and invisible process, the kind that registered in no monitoring system because no one had thought to put a monitoring system there, because the formation looked stable from any angle you could observe it from, because the failure was happening in the deep places where observation required equipment nobody had reason to deploy. An afternoon's careful work, his hands flat on the limestone at the base of the valley wall, Gray's awareness moving through him like current through a wire, Ember circling somewhere above in a sky that was otherwise empty, and offering something he could only describe as ballast, a counterweight, a steadying. And a pressure he still could not fully articulate, would not have been able to describe to anyone in any technical language, but which he felt as clearly as he felt the click of a component seating correctly, the particular give, and then resistance that meant you had found the right position. The formation settled back into a balance that would hold, Gray communicated, for another century. He sat for a while with his back against the limestone afterward, eating the sandwich he had brought and looking out over the valley he had just, in some sense he was still integrating, repaired. The valley looked exactly the same as it had before. It would look exactly the same tomorrow and the day after and for decades to come. No one would ever know that anything had happened here. No one would ever know that 60 years of invisible deterioration had been addressed on a Wednesday afternoon by a mechanic from a town of 9,000 people eating a cheese sandwich against a limestone wall. This did not bother him the way he might have expected it to. He had fixed things before that no one ever noticed, had kept cars running that their owners stopped thinking about the moment they left the garage, had repaired things whose continued function was so seamless that its very seamlessness meant it was never thought about again. That was the goal, that was the point. You fixed something well enough that it disappeared back into the normal functioning of a life, and if you had done it right, it would stay disappeared for a long time. He was starting to understand that this principle scaled. The aquifer repair was harder. 2 counties over, through several weekends that began in the cold early mornings when the stars were still present and ended in the dark. And he drove home both nights of the first weekend feeling hollowed out in a way that he recognized from the hardest jobs he'd ever done, not depleted exactly, but used in the specific way that means you have given a thing everything you had available and the work has taken all of it. He ate more than usual those weekends. Slept more deeply than he had in years, the sleep of a man who has given the day everything it asked for. The flaw in the aquifer was, in mechanical terms, like a cracked cylinder wall, a structural integrity failure in something load-bearing, something that other systems depended on, something whose failure would not be local. The crack was not new. It had been developing, Gray indicated, for decades, had been one of the things on the list of the things that needed addressing but was not yet urgent, not yet at the stage where urgency was the operative word, though the distance between not yet urgent and critical was shorter than he would have liked. 3 weekends. The third one felt different from the first two, less effortful, more like the difference between forcing a thing and finding its natural movement. There was a moment in the middle of the second Saturday of that third weekend where something shifted, where he felt the system recognize its own correction and begin, tentatively, to participate in it. And the feeling was so similar to the feeling of an engine turning over after a rebuild, that first clean catch, that first full rotation where everything is doing what it's supposed to do, that he laughed out loud there in the cold forest, 2 counties from anywhere, with no one to hear it except the 2 enormous shapes that were not quite visible in the trees above him. He felt warmth from that direction. He took it as acknowledgement. He went home that Sunday exhausted and deeply satisfied in a way that reminded him of the first engine he had ever rebuilt entirely on his own. 16 years old in his uncle's garage in the summer, a 1973 Ford pickup whose engine had seized from neglect, a 2-month project that he had been told, gently and not unkindly, was probably not worth completing. He had completed it. He had known it was worth it before he could have explained why, had known with the certainty you have about certain things before you have the knowledge to justify the certainty. And he had been right, and the truck had run for another 8 years before his uncle finally sold it. He thought about that truck sometimes these days, thought about the lineage of things, the way a willingness expressed once to stay with something past the point where reason said to leave becomes part of you permanently, becomes a fact about the kind of person you are, a fact that compounds over time. He learned that the world was, at its core, a machine. Not a metaphor, not a way of talking about it. Actually, functionally, in the deepest sense he understood the word, a machine. Enormously complex, more complex than anything he had ever approached before, more variables than he could hold in his mind simultaneously, more interacting systems than he could track even with the augmented perception that working with Gray and Ember had given him over these months. Breathtakingly old. Full of interdependencies that had been maintained, largely, by things that humanity had spent several centuries reclassifying from beings into legends, from legends into myths, from myths into the charming and faintly embarrassing remnants of a pre-scientific worldview. He did not find this infuriating. He might have expected some anger at the collective decision to set aside the understanding of these things in favor of an understanding that was powerful and real and genuinely transformative, and yet was operating, he now knew, on a model of the world that was missing several layers. He didn't find anger, though. He found something closer to the feeling of looking at a schematic and realizing it's missing a component. And the component isn't anyone's fault. It's just something no one thought to include because no one had seen it work. He found, instead, the only feeling that had ever sustained him through difficult work. He found that there was a great deal to be done, and that he was in a position to do some of it, and that this was sufficient. He was good at it, that was the other thing. He was genuinely, demonstrably good at it in ways that continued to clarify over time, not because he had been selected for extraordinary gifts, but because 15 years of keeping broken things running, of refusing to let the assessment finished become the end of the conversation, of treating the words beyond repair as a challenge to one's diagnostic creativity rather than a fact, had given him something rarer than talent. It had given him the refusal to give up on something just because the odds said it was finished. He had held that refusal 1,000 times. had held it over engines and transmissions and frames and electrical systems that other shops had turned away, that customers had given up on, that the math said weren't worth the parts. And he had found every single time that the math didn't know everything the math didn't know. That finished and can't be fixed were two different things, separated by the distance between someone who had given up and someone who hadn't. The dragons grew stronger. Not fully, he was clear-eyed about this, held it with the same clarity he held all his realistic assessments, which were not pessimism but precision. Some of what had been lost over the centuries could not be recovered. The erosion of certain things was irreversible. The architecture of those losses was now load-bearing in its own way, and dismantling it would cause different and worse problems. He had learned early to identify the things that couldn't be recovered and set them aside without grief, or with grief briefly, appropriately, the grief that any honest acknowledgement of loss deserves, and then move forward with what remained. This was not acceptance in the resigned sense. It was acceptance in the engineering sense. You work with the materials you have. But stronger, yes, measurably, visibly stronger. Ember's scales returned over the course of many months to a deep burnished red that caught the autumn light like heated copper plate, like the surface of something that had been through fire and come out clarified. The damage to her wing resolved not all at once but incrementally, over weeks of careful attention to the underlying structural failure that had caused it, Eli's most delicate work yet, and the work he was most proud of, though he would not have said so aloud. She moved differently. Not faster, not dramatically. These were not creatures for whom dramatic changes were natural, but with less accommodation. Less of the subtle adjustment of a body working around a problem it has learned to live with. Gray moved through the hills with less pain. The quality of pain is something you learn to read if you pay attention to living things for long enough, and Eli had paid attention to living things for long enough. There was a texture to the movement in the earlier months that spoke of effort being expended on what should not have required effort, the specific friction of a thing operating below its own capacity. That texture changed, became smoother. The movement through the hills had, by winter, a quality that he could only describe as ease, though ease at a scale that encompassed geography. And occasionally, very early in the mornings when he arrived at the garage before 7 and stood for a moment in the parking lot with his coffee, watching the sky lighten over the ridgeline, he would catch a glimpse of something. Vast and quiet, moving along the ridge with a deliberateness that was not haste and was not leisure but was something between them, something purposeful and unhurried and self-possessed. Moving along the ridge above the town in the early light in the mist. He would feel something in his chest on those mornings that he held quietly and did not attempt to define, until one morning it arrived with its word already attached to it, arrived already named. Belongings. Not the belonging of being from somewhere. He was from here, had been born in this town and grown up in it and stayed in it when leaving might have made more conventional sense, but that was not this. This was different. This was the belonging of understanding your place in a system large enough that your place in it had never been entirely visible to you before. Of knowing not just that you were here but why, not in the mystical sense, not in the sense of cosmic purpose handed down from above, but in the practical sense, in the sense of function. Of knowing what you contributed, specifically and concretely, to the ongoing operation of a thing larger than yourself. He had always contributed. He understood that now in a way he hadn't before. The work had always mattered in ways that extended past the transaction, past the customer satisfaction, past the visible and nameable results. But knowing the scale of it, having been shown, patiently and with great care by two creatures who had been watching long enough to be certain, made it land differently. Made the ordinary morning feel like part of something. His customers noticed something different about him, though none of them could have put a name to it if asked directly. They would pause on the question, frown, look for the specific thing they were reaching toward and find it just past the edge of description. He was the same Eli. Same burnt coffee offered without apology. Same 3-week wait held without negotiation except in cases where the car was someone's only transport to work, and then there was sometimes room quietly made. Same habit of crouching beside the customer when he was explaining what was wrong, putting himself at the level of the thing rather than standing above it, and speaking plainly about what had failed and what fixing it required and what the realistic outcome was and letting the customer decide. He didn't oversell recoveries. He didn't undersell what was possible. He gave people the truth in language they could use and he let them make their own choices. But there was a steadiness to him now that sat differently than before. A quality of attention, not increased focus exactly, but a different quality of presence, the way certain people are present in a room, present in a way that registers without being performed. Like a man who had been shown something true and large and had found in the experience of it not the vertigo he might have expected but a strange and solid ground. Like a man who knew where he stood in relation to things, and found the relationship clarifying rather than diminishing, and carried that clarity lightly. Like a man who had been shown the size of the thing he was part of and had discovered, rather than terror, a kind of profound and practical peace. He never told anyone the full story. There was no decision about this. It wasn't that he chose silence exactly, but that he understood with the same wordless certainty with which he understood what an engine needed that the story was not the point. The story was just the scaffolding. The point was the work. And the work was happening, and would continue happening, quietly and without acknowledgement, in the hill country and the quarry land and the old forests, on the weekends, while the town went about its ordinary business. Some things he had come to believe work better when they aren't explained, when they are simply, consistently, persistently done. Every morning, Eli Marsh opened his garage at 7:30. He put on the coffee. He raised the bay door, which made the same sound it had always made, a particular mechanical complaint, medium register, with a catch halfway up that he could fix but had never gotten around to fixing, which was perhaps a small irony he was aware of. He turned on the fluorescent lights, which flickered once before catching, as they always did, and illuminated the bay in the flat, honest light of a workspace. He went to work, and somewhere in the hills above town, something ancient and enormous moved along the ridgeline in the early morning mist, patient and purposeful, watching over a valley that held together better than it had the day before, better than it had for decades, better than it had in the long, slow time of its forgetting. Watching and waiting and moving through the hills with something that, if you had the eyes to read it and the stillness to look for long enough, might have looked very much like ease. The world held. Not perfectly, not without cost, without work, without the specific and ordinary effort of someone who opened a garage at 7:30 every morning and took his tools into the hill country on weekends without telling anyone why. Not without the ongoing attention of two creatures who were still old and still diminished from what they had once been, but were less so than they had been, and were trending, quietly and without drama, in the right direction. The world held together a little better than it had the day before. Which was all that could be asked of any given day's work. Which was, Eli had come to understand enough.